Grace Montgomery pressed her palm flat against the closed bedroom door and told herself she would not cry. Not tonight, not ever again. She had sold herself not to a man who wanted her, but to one who needed a solution. Behind her, the candle on the dresser burned low. Outside, the Carolina summer heat pressed against the windows like something alive. She was 26 years old, alone, broke, and married to a man who had not even looked at her during the ceremony. This is her story. And it is far from over. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to this channel, hit that bell, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's begin. The wedding had lasted 40 minutes. Grace had counted every single one of them. She stood in the sitting room of Blackmore No Wellington Manor. Now she reminded herself, with her single trunk of belongings still unpacked in the corner of the room, and her wedding ring sitting heavy and unfamiliar on her left hand. The ring was beautiful, gold inlaid with a small sapphire. It had belonged to someone else first. She knew that without being told. The house was enormous, and it smelled like pine resin and old money, and something underneath both of those things that Grace could not name. Something closed off. Something grieving. A woman named Mrs. Holt, stiff-backed, gray-haired, with eyes that had clearly already decided their opinion of Grace, appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Wellington requests you join him in the study." She did not say please. She did not say welcome. She folded her hands in front of her apron and waited. Grace followed her down the hall. Graham Wellington was standing with his back to the door when she entered. He was looking out the window at the Carolina landscape. The rolling summer fields, the distant tree line dark against a violet sky. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered in a way that looked like it had once been earned by hard work and was now simply a remnant of a younger version of himself. His hair was dark. He had not spoken more than 7 words to her during the ceremony. He turned when he heard her enter. "Miss Mont—" He stopped, corrected himself. "Mrs. Wellington." "Mr. Wellington," Grace said. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. She sat. He did not. "I want to be direct with you," he said. "I find that clarity prevents suffering in the long run." "I appreciate that," Grace said carefully. "This arrangement was made out of necessity. On both sides, I'm told." He said it without cruelty, but without warmth either. The way a man reads the terms of a business contract aloud. "You needed financial security following the death of your employer. I needed a woman of some competence to manage this household and provide stability for my daughters." Grace held her hands in her lap and said nothing. I am not looking for a companion," Graham continued. He said the word companion like it cost him something to even speak it. My first wife, Margaret, she passed 14 months ago. The girls are still—" He paused. "They are still adjusting." "I understand," Grace said. "I don't think you do," he said. "Not unkindly, just honestly. But I hope in time you will." He moved to his desk, opened a drawer, removed a folded document. He slid it across the surface toward her. "This outlines your responsibilities. The household accounts, the management of staff, the girls' daily schedules. Mrs. Holt will assist you, though she—" Another pause. "She was very loyal to Margaret. She may require time as well." Grace picked up the document. She did not read it right then. She looked at him instead. "Mr. Wellington," she said, "I want to be equally direct if that's permitted." He met her eyes for the first time since she had entered the room. His were dark brown, tired in a way that sleep probably couldn't fix. "Go ahead," he said. "I did not choose this situation any more than you did," she said. "I am not a fool and I am not fragile. I don't need you to pretend this is something it isn't. But I will do my job, every part of it, with full effort and full honesty. I ask only that you extend me the same respect you would extend any capable person under your employ." A beat of silence. "That's a fair ask," he said finally. "Thank you." She stood, tucked the document under her arm. "Good night, Mr. Wellington." She walked out of the study without looking back. She found the girls the next morning, or rather, Isabel found her. Grace had risen early before the house stirred and gone to the kitchen to make herself a cup of coffee because she couldn't sleep, and she wasn't yet sure where anything was, and she figured finding the kitchen was as good a start as any. She was standing at the iron stove trying to figure out the firebox when she heard the creak of the stairs. Isabel was 13. Tall for her age, with her father's dark eyes and a posture that said she had learned to carry herself straight as armor. She stopped dead in the doorway when she saw Grace. "You're not Mrs. Holt," she said. "No," Grace agreed. "I'm Grace. I'm your father's wife." Isabel's jaw tightened. "I know who you are." Grace turned back to the stove. "Do you know how this firebox opens? I can't figure the latch." A pause. Then, reluctantly, Isabel crossed the room, reached past Grace, and popped the latch with one practiced motion. "Thank you," Grace said. Isabel took a step back and crossed her arms. "Lucy cried last night," she said. "She heard you arrive. She thought—" Isabel stopped, pressed her lips together. "She thought what?" Grace asked gently. "She thought maybe Mama had come home." Isabel's voice was flat, controlled. The kind of flat that is constructed very carefully on top of something much less controlled. "She's 7. She still doesn't fully understand." Grace set down the coffee scoop and turned to face the girl fully. "I am not your mother," she said. "I would never pretend to be, and I would never ask you to treat me like I am. But I am here, and I would very much like to know both of you if you're willing." Isabel studied her for a long moment. The kind of study that only children and very old people are honest enough to do openly. "We'll see," she said. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. And Grace figured that was about as much as she had any right to expect on day 2. Lucy appeared at breakfast. She was small and round-faced, and she had her mother's coloring. Grace guessed fair hair, blue eyes, a spray of summer freckles across her nose. She climbed into her chair at the table and looked at Grace with the direct, unguarded stare of a child who has not yet learned to disguise her feelings. "Are you staying?" Lucy asked. "Yes," Grace said. "Forever." Grace glanced at Isabel, who was watching this exchange with that same careful neutrality. "For a good long while," Grace said. Lucy considered this. Then she picked up her spoon and began eating her porridge, apparently satisfied. Graham Wellington appeared in the dining room doorway shortly after. He looked at the three of them seated at the breakfast table, and something moved across his face, some complicated, unnamed thing, and then was gone. "Good morning," he said, stiffly. To all of them, to none of them. "Good morning, Papa," Lucy said. Isabel said nothing. Graham sat at the head of the table. He unfolded his newspaper. Grace poured her own coffee and thought, well, this is what it is. Make of it what you can. The first 3 weeks were like learning to walk in someone else's shoes. Grace learned the rhythms of the house. She learned that Mrs. Holt kept the linens counted and recounted out of some compulsion that had nothing to do with anyone else touching them, and that the easiest path forward was simply to let her. She learned that the kitchen boy, a 16-year-old named Tad, was frightened of chickens, and that the cook, a stout woman named Della, ruled her domain with absolute authority and responded well to being asked her opinion before any decision was made. She learned that Lucy followed her through the house at a cautious distance like a barn cat testing whether the newcomer was safe, inching closer each day. And she learned that Isabel watched everything and said very little, and that this silence was not disinterest, but the opposite of it. She learned almost nothing about Graham Wellington. He was in the study before she rose and still there when she retired. He appeared for meals and ate them quickly and returned to his work. He said thank you when she made adjustments to the household accounts that freed up money for repairs he'd been putting off. He said nothing when she rearranged the sitting room to let in more light, because the darkness of the drapes had been making Lucy's headaches worse. He was not unkind. He was simply absent. Present in body. gone somewhere else entirely in everything that mattered. One evening near the end of the third week, Grace found him on the back porch, just sitting, looking at the fields going dark in the Carolina dusk. She almost turned around. Instead, she sat in the other chair. He didn't speak. She didn't either for a while. "She planted those," he said, finally nodding toward the rose bushes along the fence line. Wild now unpruned, sprawling in the summer heat. "Margaret. She planted those the spring before she—" He stopped. "They're beautiful," Grace said. "They're a mess," he said. But there was no real criticism in his voice, just fact, and underneath it, grief that had nowhere left to go. "Would it help to have them tended?" she asked. "Or would that feel like an intrusion?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he said finally. It was the most honest thing he had said to her since the study that first night. "Then I'll leave them," she said, "until you know." He looked at her then, not the businesslike assessment from their first meeting, something more careful than that. "You're a strange woman, Mrs. Wellington," he said. "I've been told that before," Grace said. She thought for one half-second that something like the ghost of a smile moved across his face, but it was dark, and she could have been wrong. It was Della who told her. "You know he found her," the cook said one afternoon, rolling biscuit dough with practiced efficiency and not looking up. "Margaret. He came home from the East Field, and she was just gone. The fever took her in 2 days. He blames himself for not calling the doctor sooner, though Lord knows there wasn't anything that man could have done." Grace said nothing, just listened. "He's a good man," Della said. There was something protective in her voice, something that said, "I am telling you this, so you understand, not so you judge. He loves those girls something fierce. He locked something up in himself after Margaret died, like he figured if he didn't feel too much, nothing could hurt him that way again." "That doesn't work," Grace said quietly. Della finally looked up. "No," she agreed. "It doesn't. But try telling him that." The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Grace was at the kitchen table going over the household ledger when Mrs. Holt brought it in on a silver tray with an expression that made Grace's stomach drop before she even reached for the envelope. The return address was from a woman named Lady No Mrs. Harriet Ashford, Charlottesville, Virginia. Grace had heard the name exactly once from Della in passing, Margaret's mother, a woman of significant wealth and apparently equally significant opinion about the management of her late daughter's children. She brought the letter to Graham. He read it standing at his desk, and Grace watched his jaw tighten incrementally with every line until he set it down with a controlled, deliberate care that suggested he wanted very much to do something else with it. "She's coming," he said. "When?" Grace asked. 3 weeks. He looked up. His eyes were flat in a way Grace was beginning to recognize. Not coldness exactly, but the look of a man building a wall between himself and something he can't afford to feel right now. "She wants to see the girls." "That's reasonable," Grace said carefully. "She wants to assess their well-being," he said. "Under my management." He said the last 2 words like they tasted wrong. Grace stood her ground. "Is there a reason she'd find cause for concern?" Graham was quiet for a beat too long. "Harriet Ashford believes that Margaret's children should have been in her custody since the day Margaret died," he said. "She made that case to my face and through 2 separate attorneys. The arrangement we have currently, the arrangement including you," he stopped, "is new," Grace said. "Is new," he confirmed, "and she will view it with suspicion." Grace looked at the letter where he'd set it on the desk. She thought about Isabel that first morning in the kitchen, popping the firebox latch without being asked. About Lucy asking, "Are you staying forever?" About the rose bushes along the fence that no one had touched because the grief of touching them was still too raw. "Then we'll make sure," Grace said, "that she finds nothing to be suspicious of." Graham looked at her with something that was not quite gratitude, but was in the same neighborhood. "You understand what I'm asking," he said. "You're not asking me anything," Grace said. "I'm offering." That night, Grace sat on the edge of her bed in the still heavy Carolina dark and let herself feel everything she had been carefully not feeling for 3 weeks. She was afraid. Not of Harriet Ashford, not yet, but of the shape of the life she had stepped into. Of how much she had already begun to care about two girls who had not asked for her. Of how complicated it was going to become. Of the man down the hall who carried his grief like a stone in his chest and didn't know how to set it down. She pressed her palm flat against the quilt beneath her and breathed. She had married a stranger to survive. She understood that. She had walked in with eyes open and no illusions. But survival, she was beginning to understand, had a way of turning into something more complicated than you planned for. She blew out the candle. Outside, the Carolina summer pressed its heat against the windows, thick and alive and relentless. She closed her eyes and let herself just for a moment be afraid. Then she set it aside. Tomorrow there was work to do. 3 weeks was not enough time to learn a man. Grace had known that going in. But she had not expected how loud his silence would be, or how much it would fill every room he was not in. She managed the house. She kept the ledgers straight. She settled the quiet war between Mrs. Holt and Della over the storage of the dry goods without either woman realizing she had done it. She made sure Lucy ate her vegetables and that Isabel had fresh candles for her late-night reading, which she did every night, and which she thought no one knew about. Grace knew. She said nothing. She was good at her job. She had always been good at whatever job was in front of her. That was the thing about being born without the safety net of money or name. You learned fast that competence was the only currency that couldn't be taken away. What she had not accounted for was Harriet Ashford arriving 10 days early. The carriage came up the drive on a Wednesday morning while Grace was in the middle of reviewing the week's kitchen inventory with Della. She heard the wheels on the gravel and felt something shift in the air of the house before she even reached the front window. Mrs. Holt was already at the door, her posture straighter than usual, her hands folded with a formality that said she knew exactly who this was. Grace stepped into the front hallway and got her first look at Harriet Ashford. The woman was perhaps 60, silver-haired and precisely dressed in traveling clothes that cost more than Grace's entire wardrobe. She carried herself like someone who had never once been told no and had consequently stopped anticipating the possibility. She swept through the front door before anyone formally invited her in and stopped dead when she saw Grace standing in the hallway. Her eyes did a single, fast, head-to-toe assessment. The kind Grace recognized immediately. She had been assessed that way her whole life. The kind that said, "I am deciding what you are worth, and I have nearly finished." "You must be the new wife," Harriet said. "Grace Wellington," Grace said. She did not extend her hand first. She had decided in the half-second she had to make decisions that she would not be the one to reach first. "And you've arrived ahead of schedule, Mrs. Ashford. We weren't expecting you until the 19th. Something flickered in Harriet's eyes. Not quite surprise. More like recalibration. "Travel plans change," Harriet said simply. "Of course. Let me find Mr. Wellington. He'll want to know you're here." "I'm sure he will." Grace found Graham in the stable yard talking to his foreman about the east fence, and she told him quietly and directly the way she told him everything and watched the color drain from his face by about 2 degrees. "She's here," he said. "She is. She's 10 days early." "I'm aware." He looked at her. "Is she?" "She is exactly what you'd expect," Grace said. "Composed, sharp, already assessing." She held his gaze. "Don't let her see you off balance. If she sees you off balance, she'll know where to push." Graham looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read. "When did you learn to strategize?" he asked. "About 30 seconds ago," Grace said. "Come inside." Harriet Ashford sat in the front parlor with a cup of tea she had apparently requested from Mrs. Holt, without waiting to be asked, and she watched Graham walk in with the particular stillness of a woman who has made a decision and is now simply watching events catch up to her conclusion. "Harriet," Graham said, You look well. Graham. She set her teacup down. You look tired. It's summer. The fields are demanding. Of course. Her eyes moved to Grace, who had come to stand a half step behind Graham, and to his right, close enough to be present, far enough to give him space. And how are my granddaughters? They're well, Graham said. Lucy has grown 3 inches since Christmas. Isabel's been... I'd like to see them, Harriet said. Not a request. They're with their tutor until noon, Grace said pleasantly. I can have them brought down at lunch if that suits you, or we can wait until the afternoon session is finished, and they can give you their full attention. Harriet looked at her directly. You manage the schedule? I manage the household, Grace said. Same pleasant tone. That includes the girls' daily routine. Yes. A beat of silence. Harriet picked up her teacup again. Afternoon will be fine, she said. Isabel handled the introduction the way she handled most things, with her spine straight and her feelings invisible. She shook her grandmother's hand, answered questions in complete sentences, and gave nothing away. Grace watched and felt a strange, fierce pride in the girl that she had absolutely no right to feel and felt anyway. Lucy, on the other hand, climbed immediately into Harriet's lap. Grandmama, I lost another tooth, Lucy announced. And Grace made a poultice for my headaches that actually works, not like the terrible medicine Dr. Pearson gives that makes everything taste like copper. Harriet looked up over Lucy's head at Grace. Grace smiled and said nothing. Harriet said, A poultice. Willow bark and lavender, Grace said. My mother's recipe. Old remedy but effective. Harriet ran her hand over Lucy's hair in a gesture that was, Grace noticed, genuinely tender. Whatever the woman was, and Grace was not yet sure what she was, she loved these girls. That much was real. Did you know her? Lucy asked her grandmother. Grace, I mean. Before she married Papa. No, Harriet said. She's good at the firebox, Isabel offered with the particular deadpan of a 13-year-old, making a peace offering that she would never call a peace offering. Grace pressed her lips together to keep the smile contained. That night she heard them fighting. She was not eavesdropping, she was on her way to the kitchen for water, and the study door was not fully closed, and the voices were not quiet. She stopped in the hallway, and she told herself she should walk on. She stayed. You married a servant, Graham. Harriet's voice was controlled, but there was a blade in it. Margaret has been dead 14 months, and you brought a stranger into this house to raise her children. Grace is not a servant. She is my wife. In name. In every legal and practical sense. The girls have, Graham said, and his voice had an edge to it. Grace had not heard before. Not anger exactly, something more complicated. They have a stable home. They have routine. They have someone who is present. Harriet, which is more than they had the first 6 months after Margaret died, when I was barely keeping myself upright. Silence. That is not fair, Harriet said quietly. It isn't. You're right. I'm sorry. A beat. But they are not suffering. I need you to see that. I see a man who made a fast decision under pressure, Harriet said. And I see a woman I know nothing about who has access to my granddaughters' lives. Then get to know her, Graham said. Another silence, longer this time. She's harder to dismiss than I expected, Harriet said finally. It was not a compliment, but it was not nothing either. Grace walked quietly back to her room. She lay on her bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and turned the words over in her mind, harder to dismiss than I expected, and decided to take it as the closest thing to a foothold she was likely to get. The next morning, Harriet found her in the garden. Not the rose bushes, Grace still hadn't touched those, the kitchen garden where she was checking on the late summer herbs. Walk with me, Harriet said. It was not a question. They walked. My daughter, Harriet began after a silence long enough to feel deliberate, was the best woman I have ever known. She was kind and she was brilliant and she laughed so loud it startled people who didn't know her. She paused. And she chose Graham Wellington, which I will confess I did not initially understand. He is not an easy man. No, Grace agreed. But she loved him. Harriet's voice was quiet now. And he loved her. I watched it for 11 years and it was real. What they had was real. Grace said nothing. She waited. I am not here to make your life difficult, Harriet said. She stopped walking, turned to look at Grace directly. I want you to understand that whatever you may have concluded from last night. Grace met her eyes. I concluded that you love your granddaughters and you are trying to protect them. That doesn't make your life difficult for mine. It just means we want the same thing. Harriet studied her for a long moment. What did you do before this? Harriet asked. I was a companion and housekeeper for a widow in Richmond. When she died, she left her estate to a nephew, and I had 2 months and $40. And Graham Wellington was an opportunity, Grace said plainly. I won't pretend otherwise. I went in with open eyes. So did he. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Harriet's expression. Grace couldn't tell yet if it was respect or simply revised strategy. Are you fond of them? Harriet asked. Isabel and Lucy. The answer came before Grace could decide whether or not to moderate it. Yes, more than I expected. More than is probably wise given how new this all is. She paused. But I don't know how to be around children without meaning it. I haven't got that skill. For the first time, something that was not entirely calculation moved across Harriet Ashford's face. No, she said quietly. I don't suppose that's a skill worth having. She turned and walked back toward the house. Grace stood in the kitchen garden for a moment longer and breathed. She had not won anything. But she had not lost either. The twist came from nowhere. The way the worst things always do. It was the 4th day of Harriet's visit, and Grace was in the upstairs hallway when she heard the cough. It stopped her cold. Not because it was loud, it wasn't. It was quiet. Wet. The kind of cough that sounds like something trying to stay contained and failing. It was coming from Isabel's room. Grace knocked. No answer. She opened the door. Isabel was sitting on the edge of her bed. Her face was flushed deeply unevenly, and she was holding her own arms across her chest, like she was trying to hold herself together from the outside. Isabel. Grace was across the room in 3 steps. She pressed her palm to the girl's forehead and felt the heat hit her like a wall. How long have you been feeling this way? Since yesterday, Isabel said. Her voice was rough. I didn't want to say anything. Grandmother is here and I didn't want to. How long since yesterday? Since the morning. She looked up, and for the first time since Grace had arrived, the armor was entirely down. Isabel looked 13. She looked scared. Is it bad? Grace kept her face calm. She had learned long ago that fear is contagious, and calm is a choice. I'm going to send for Dr. Pearson. Can you tell me if your throat hurts? Yes, and my neck. And I have... Isabel pushed back the collar of her nightgown, and Grace saw the rash. The world went very quiet for approximately 3 seconds. Scarlet fever. Grace had seen it once before in Richmond in the house of a neighbor. She knew what the rash looked like. She knew what the rash meant. She stood up straight. She kept her voice even. I need you to lie down and stay warm, she said. I'm going to get your father and send Tad for the doctor right now. You're going to be all right. She said that last sentence, not because she was certain of it. She said it because Isabel was 13 years old and scared, and she needed to hear it. Don't tell Lucy, Isabel said. She'll cry. I'll handle Lucy. Grace squeezed the girl's hand once quick and firm. Lie down. She walked out of the room at a controlled pace, pulled the door closed, and then moved fast. Graham was out of his chair before she finished the second sentence. Are you certain? He said. I'm not a doctor, Grace said. But I've seen it before and I'm not willing to wait 2 hours for Dr. Pearson to tell us what I already think we know. He was already moving toward the door. Send Tad now, Grace said. I'll need the doctor's full kit, and keep Harriet and Lucy away from that room. Scarlet fever spreads, and Lucy especially cannot. Lucy is not strong, Graham said. The words were flat, stripped. She heard everything underneath them. I know, Grace said, which is why we move right now. He looked at her across the hallway. There was something in his face she had never seen there before. Not the controlled distance of the past weeks, not the careful blankness he used as armor. This was raw. This was a father who had already watched his wife die in this house and could not survive watching his daughter. Graham. Grace's voice was quiet, direct. She is going to need to see you be steady. Can you do that? He pulled a breath in through his nose, set his jaw. Yes, he said. Then go to her. I'll handle the rest. She was already turning toward the stairs. Behind her, she heard him say her name. She looked back. Thank you, he said. Just that. Just 2 words. But the way he said them was not the way you thank the woman who manages your household accounts. Grace nodded once. Then she ran. Dr. Pearson arrived within the hour. He confirmed what Grace had already known. He administered what he could, gave his instructions, and told Graham with the practiced gravity of a man who delivered bad news regularly that Isabel was young and otherwise healthy, and those were factors in her favor. But the fever needs to break within 48 hours, he said. If it doesn't. He left the sentence where it was. Grace stood in the doorway of Isabel's room that evening and watched the girl sleep restless, flushed her breathing too shallow, and felt something settle in her chest like stone. This was not her child. She had known this girl for less than a month. She had no legal claim to her, no history with her, nothing but 29 days of careful tentative orbit around each other. And she was not going to let her die. Behind her in the hallway, she heard a small sound. She turned. Lucy was standing there in her nightgown, bare feet on the floorboards. Her face scrunched against tears. She was clearly trying very hard not to cry. Is Isabel going to be like Mama? Lucy whispered. Grace crossed to her immediately. She crouched down to eye level. No, she said, firm, sure, even though she was neither. Isabel is going to fight, and she is going to win because she is the toughest 13-year-old I have ever met in my life. Do you believe me? Lucy's chin wobbled. I want to believe you. Then start there, Grace said. Sometimes that's enough. She picked Lucy up and carried her back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed until the little girl finally fell asleep. Then she went back to Isabel's door, and she sat down on the floor in the hallway outside it, her back against the wall, and she kept watch. Somewhere in the house a clock ticked. The summer heat pressed in. The 48 hours had started. She did not sleep. She told herself she would rest for an hour, just an hour, with her back against the hallway wall, and her ears tuned to every sound behind Isabel's door. But every time her eyes closed, she heard something, a shift in the girl's breathing, a restless movement, a sound that might have been a word, and she was on her feet before she was fully awake. By 3 a.m, Graham found her there. He came up the stairs carrying a candle and stopped when he saw her on the floor. He said nothing for a moment, just looked at her the way a man looks at something he doesn't yet know what to do with. You should sleep, he said. So should you, Grace said. He sat down on the floor beside her. It was such an unexpected thing, Graham Wellington, with his stiff posture and his careful distance, folding himself down onto the hallway floor at 3 a.m, that Grace almost said something. She didn't. They sat in silence for a while, both of them listening to the sounds of the house. She's always been the strong one, Graham said finally. Even as a small child, Margaret used to say Isabel came into the world with her mind already made up. His voice was low, controlled, but underneath it something was fraying. She's more like Margaret than she knows. She's got that same way of refusing to let anything beat her. Then she'll fight this, Grace said. Margaret fought too. He said it quietly. Margaret fought for 2 days and it didn't matter. Grace sat with that for a moment, the weight of it. This is different, she said. You don't know that. No, she admitted. But I know Isabel has a good doctor, a strong constitution, and her father sitting in the hallway at 3 in the morning refusing to leave. That counts for something." Graham was quiet. Then roughly, "It didn't count for enough last time." Grace did not offer him false comfort. She had learned already that he would see through it, and it would do more damage than silence. So she just stayed where she was, shoulder close to his in the dark hallway, and let him feel what he was feeling without trying to fix it. After a while, his breathing evened out. They kept watch together until dawn. The second morning, Isabel's fever climbed. Dr. Pearson came back at 8, examined her, adjusted the treatment, and spoke to Graham in the hallway with a lowered voice that Grace was close enough to hear anyway. The fever was not breaking the way it should. It was not yet critical, but the direction of it was wrong. "What does that mean?" Graham said. "It means we keep doing what we're doing and we hope for a turn by tonight," the doctor said. "I've seen children come through worse than this." "I've also seen children not come through at all," Graham said flatly. The doctor had nothing to say to that. After he left, Grace went into the kitchen and stood at the work table and made herself think. She had done nothing but react for the last 20 hours, moving fast, solving immediate problems, keeping everyone else's fear contained enough that the house could keep functioning. But the fever was climbing, and the doctor's treatment wasn't turning it, and she had a girl upstairs with 48 hours on the clock and maybe 20 left on it. She thought about her mother. Her mother had kept a book, not a formal book. Nothing written by a doctor, just a small, cloth-covered journal full of remedies and notes in her narrow handwriting, accumulated from a lifetime of making do without money for physicians. Grace had the book. It was in her trunk. She went and got it. She sat at the kitchen table and turned pages reading fast cross-referencing, and landed on the entry she had been trying to remember since the moment she saw Isabel's rash. Foxglove, digitalis. Regulates the heart's rhythm, strengthens the pulse. Draws down fever in severe cases. Used in small, carefully measured amounts. Dangerous in excess. Not for the faint of heart or the uncertain hand. There was a note in the margin in her mother's handwriting. Mrs. Carver's boy, 1797. 3 days in. Nothing else was working. He recovered. Grace sat with her hands flat on the table and stared at that note for a long moment. Foxglove was not a standard treatment. Dr. Pearson would not use it. The medical establishment in 1815 barely acknowledged its application, and the ones who did were considered fringe. It was risky. It required precision. It required nerve. She closed the book, opened it again, closed it. Then she went to find Graham. "Absolutely not," he said. "Graham, no." He turned from the window. His voice was hard. "You want to give my daughter an unproven botanical treatment based on a note in your mother's journal. The answer is no. The answer is that Dr. Pearson's treatment isn't working and the fever is going the wrong direction," Grace said. She kept her voice even, steady. She needed him to hear reason, and she could not give him reason if she let herself get loud about it. "I know this is frightening. I know it seems reckless," he said. "It seems like exactly the kind of desperate gamble that—" "What's the alternative?" she said. "We wait and hope the fever turns on its own. We watch her get worse and tell each other the doctor knows best." She took a step forward. "I am not asking you to do this blindly. I am asking you to look at what I know, what my mother documented, and make a decision with me. Not for me. With me." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were the eyes of a man being asked to walk out onto ice that might not hold. "If something happens to her," he started. "If we do nothing and something happens to her," Grace said quietly, "you will ask yourself for the rest of your life whether this would have made the difference." The silence that followed was the longest 10 seconds Grace had experienced in recent memory. "Show me the book," he said. She showed him. He read every word his mother had written, including the margin note. He turned the page and read the follow-up note she had added years later, confirming the boy from the Carver household had lived to adulthood. He set the book down and pressed both hands flat on the table and stared at nothing. "The dosage," he said. "You're certain of it?" "I have measured it 3 times," Grace said. I would measure it 3 more times before I give her a drop. And if it goes wrong, then it goes wrong and I carry that, Grace said. Not you, me. This is my call if you'll give me your trust, and I understand completely if you won't. He was quiet for one more moment. Do it, he said. His voice was rough. God help us both do it. She measured the dosage 4 times. She was not embarrassed about the 4th time. She took it to Isabel herself. The girl was half awake, her eyes glassy with fever, her hair damp against the pillow. I'm going to give you something, Grace said, leaning close, keeping her voice low and calm. It's going to taste terrible, and I need you to drink all of it. Isabel managed to focus on her face. Is it the copper stuff? No, it's my mother's recipe. Grace held up the small cup. It's going to help Isabel, I promise you. You keep making promises, Isabel murmured. And I keep meaning them, Grace said. Isabel drank it. She made a face that under other circumstances would have been funny. She sank back against the pillow. Grace sat beside her and did not leave. Harriet Ashford found out 2 hours later. Grace heard her in the hallway talking to Graham in a voice that was trying very hard to stay quiet and not quite managing. She gave her what? A botanical treatment, Graham said. Based on a based on a note in a journal, Harriet said. Graham, you allowed this woman to administer an experimental medicine to Isabel without consulting a physician, without consulting me. She is my daughter, Graham said. She is Margaret's daughter, Harriet said. And the way she said it, low, fierce, devastated, was not a weapon, Grace realized. It was a wound. It was a mother's grief being spoken in the only language it currently had available. Grace came out of Isabel's room and stood in the hallway. Mrs. Ashford, she said. Harriet turned. The look on her face was not anger so much as fear wearing anger's clothes. You had no right. You're correct, Grace said. I acted on her father's authorization, but I want you to understand that I would have done the same regardless, and I will not pretend otherwise. She held the woman's gaze. I could not stand in that room and watch her get worse and do nothing. I am not built that way. I'm sorry if that frightens you, but I am not sorry for the choice. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Her hands were trembling slightly, just slightly. If she is harmed, Harriet started, then you will have every right to whatever comes next, Grace said quietly. But she is not going to be harmed. She is going to be all right. I need you to believe that, Mrs. Ashford. Not for me, for yourself. The silence stretched. Then Harriet turned away. She went into Isabel's room and sat in the chair beside the bed and took her granddaughter's hand, and Grace let her. The next 6 hours were the longest of Grace's life. She checked on Isabel every 30 minutes. Temperature, pulse, breathing. She wrote down the numbers each time in a small notebook the way her mother had taught her, because panic is harder to sustain when you're collecting data, and because she needed to see the numbers in front of her instead of just feeling them. For the first 4 hours, nothing changed. At the 5-hour mark, the fever ticked up a ½ degree, and Grace felt the bottom of her stomach drop clean out. She sat on the edge of the hallway and pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed for 60 seconds, then stood back up. Is it working? Graham said. He had not left the upstairs hallway. He was wearing the same clothes he had been wearing yesterday. Give it more time, Grace said. That's not an answer. I know. She looked at him. Graham, I need you to trust me for 2 more hours. Can you do that? He looked back at her. There was something enormous living behind his eyes, something that had been there since she first walked into his study 7 weeks ago, and that she was only now beginning to understand the full shape of grief. Yes, but also something worse than grief. Guilt. The particular torture of a man who believes that losing the people he loves is somehow his fault. You have 2 hours, he said quietly. And Grace, if this doesn't work, I need you to know I don't. He stopped, pressed his jaw together, started again. I don't blame you. I want you to know that before, whatever happens. She had not expected that. She nodded once fast because if she tried to say anything, she wasn't going to manage it cleanly. She went back into the room. At the 6-hour mark, Isabel's fever broke. It didn't break dramatically. It broke the way real things break gradually, then all at once. Grace had her hand on the girl's forehead when she felt the heat begin almost imperceptibly to ease. She sat very still. She kept her hand there. She counted to 30. It was real. She went to the door and opened it. Graham was standing 3 feet away, as if he had known, as if something in him had felt it too. "The fever is dropping," Grace said. He stared at her. "It's working," she said. "She's going to be all right." What happened then was not something Grace had prepared herself for, and not something she could entirely describe afterward. Graham Wellington controlled distant, carefully armored Graham Wellington covered the space between them in 2 steps and pulled her in and held on. Not gently. The way a man holds on when he has been terrified for 30 hours and the fear has just broken open into something else. Grace held on back. She could feel him shaking slightly. She could feel the weeks of distance dissolving into something raw and real and completely unplanned. She kept her arms around him and let it be what it was. After a moment, he pulled back, cleared his throat, looked away, then back with an expression that was embarrassed and grateful, and about a dozen other things at once. "Thank you," he said. "She's the one who fought," Grace said. He shook his head. "You know what I mean." She did. From inside the room came a small, scratchy voice. "Is someone going to tell me the fever broke, or are you two going to stand in the doorway all night?" They both turned. Isabel was looking at them with heavy eyes and an expression that was trying very hard to be sardonic, and mostly achieving it, despite the fact that she was the color of old linen and had clearly not brushed her hair in 2 days. "You're awake," Grace said. "Unfortunately," Isabel said. Grace laughed. She didn't mean to. It came out before she could stop it, a real full laugh that surprised even her. Graham made a sound that was something between a cough and a laugh. Isabel looked at both of them with the particular exasperation of a 13-year-old surrounded by adults behaving strangely. "I'm thirsty," she announced. "And I would like it noted for the record that whatever Grace gave me tasted like the bottom of a swamp." "Noted," Grace said. She was already moving to get water. Noted and recorded for posterity. Y'all. She was in the kitchen later, just standing at the table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink when Harriet Ashford walked in. Grace straightened. Harriet held up one hand. "Don't." She sat down across the table without being invited and folded her hands in front of her. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, "Margaret would have done the same thing." Grace said nothing. "She was like that," Harriet said. Her voice was quieter than Grace had heard it yet, stripped of its authority, just a woman talking. "She never could stand watching someone suffer when she thought she could do something about it. It used to terrify me when she was young." A pause. "It was one of the things I admired most about her." Grace sat down slowly. "I owe you an apology," Harriet said. It clearly cost her something to say it. "I came here looking for fault because I was afraid. Because I thought—" She stopped. Restarted. "I thought if someone replaced Margaret too quickly, too easily, then everything she was would simply be erased. Like she had never been here at all." "She will never be erased," Grace said carefully. "Not by me. Not by anything. Those girls carry her with them every single day. Graham carries her. I would not take that from any of them, even if I could." Harriet looked at her directly. "You love them already," she said. Not an accusation this time, an observation. Grace didn't answer right away. She looked at her cold coffee, looked up. "I'm afraid so," she said. Something in Harriet's face shifted. Not entirely, not completely, but enough. "Then we will find a way to manage each other, Mrs. Wellington," she said. She stood, straightened her dress, and walked out of the kitchen with her posture perfectly intact. Grace sat at the table alone and let out a breath that felt like it had been held for approximately 7 weeks, One battle over. She knew it without being told. The next one hadn't started yet. But somewhere in this house right now, a child was sleeping with a breaking fever, and a man was sitting by her bed with his hand around his daughter's hand, and Grace allowed herself for exactly 30 seconds to feel the full weight of what they had just come through together. 30 seconds. Then she got up. Because there was still work to do, and she was above all things a woman who knew how to work. She rinsed her coffee cup and went back upstairs. Isabel recovered slowly. Not the way it happened in stories where the crisis breaks and the patient sits up the next morning bright-eyed and asking for breakfast. The real version was slower and less clean, 3 days of exhausted sleep. A 4th day of broth and short sentences, a 5th day where she made it to the chair by the window for an hour before asking to go back to bed. Grace counted every one of those days like a rosary. Harriet Ashford stayed. That surprised Grace more than almost anything else that had happened. She had expected the woman to declare a tentative truce and head back to Charlottesville within a day of Isabel's fever breaking. Instead, she remained eating her meals at the family table, sitting with Isabel in the afternoons, and conducting what Grace could only describe as a careful, ongoing assessment of everything she saw. It was not hostile. That was the strangest part. Whatever had shifted between them in the kitchen that night had not reversed itself. Harriet had not become warm exactly. She was not a warm woman by nature, Grace suspected, and Margaret's death had probably calcified what warmth there had been, but she had become something more honest. She asked direct questions, and she listened to the answers. She stopped flinching whenever Grace made a decision about the girl's routine. She also, on the 7th day, said something that changed the shape of everything. Grace was in the hallway when it happened. She hadn't meant to hear it. She was coming up the stairs, and Harriet was in Isabel's room with the door half open, and she heard Harriet say quietly to the girl, "She is good for you. I want you to know I see that." And Isabel, in the voice of someone who has been thinking something for a while and is finally willing to say it, "I know. I've known for a while." Grace kept walking. She did not let herself stop and feel it until she was alone in her own room with the door closed. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands over her mouth and breathed through it. She had not expected to matter this much to them. She had not planned for it. And now that it was happening, she did not know what to do with the terror of how much there was to lose. The letter arrived on a Thursday, not from Harriet this time. From an attorney in Charlottesville, a man named Elias Hargrove of the firm Hargrove & Webb, who wrote in the precise, bloodless language of the law that his client, Mrs. Harriet Ashford, was pursuing legal petition for guardianship of Isabel and Lucy Wellington minors on the grounds of, and here, the language got careful and terrible concerns regarding the fitness and stability of the current household environment. Grace read it twice. Then she went downstairs and found Graham. He had already received the same letter. He was standing in his study, holding it with both hands, and his face was a color she had not seen on him before. Not anger, not grief, something worse than both. The look of a man who has just been betrayed by something he thought he could trust. She said, He stopped. She sat at my table. She ate my food. She told me she was not here to make things difficult. Graham? Grace's voice was steady. She was not steady, but her voice was. When was this filed? He looked at the date on the letter. 8 days ago. 8 days ago. 4 days before Isabel's fever broke. Before the kitchen conversation. Before I see that she is good for you. She filed this before Isabel got sick, Grace said. He looked up. The timeline, Grace said. This was already in motion when she arrived. She didn't come here to assess the situation. She came here because she had already decided, and she wanted evidence to support a decision she'd already made. The silence that followed was long and very quiet. Then why? He stopped. Because she didn't expect Isabel to get sick, Grace said, and she didn't expect me to save her. She heard how that sounded. She did not soften it. And I think whatever she saw over those 48 hours changed something in her. But it doesn't matter what it changed in her, Graham, because this letter is already filed, and it has a court date on it. He looked at the letter again. Read the date. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks, Grace confirmed. He set the letter on the desk. He turned to the window. He put both hands on the windowsill and stood there, and Grace could see the effort it cost him to hold himself together at the seams. "She will take them from me," he said. Not to Grace, just to the heir, to the fact of it. "She has the money, and she has the lawyers, and she has the name, and a judge in Charlottesville will see a widower who remarried fast, and a young wife with no family and no money and no—" "Stop," Grace said. He turned. "You don't get to lose this before it happens," she said. "I need you to hear me. You have a household that runs. You have 2 daughters who are thriving. You have a documented case of me managing a medical crisis that saved Isabel's life. You have Harriet Ashford herself, who may have filed this petition, but who also sat in this house for a week and watched something real happen." She moved to the desk, picked up the letter, set it back down, face down, like the removal of it from his sight might help. "And you have me." He looked at her. "You have me," she said again, quietly this time. "Whatever I am in this house, whatever this arrangement is or isn't, I am here and I am not leaving, and I will stand in front of any judge in any courtroom in the state of Virginia and account for myself. Do you understand?" Something moved through his face. Something she had been watching build for weeks, layer by layer, under all the walls and the distance and the grief. "Why?" he said. It came out rougher than he probably intended. "Why would you? These aren't your children, Grace. This isn't your fight. You came here because you needed safety, and I offered a transaction, and you are not obligated." "I know I'm not obligated," she said. "I also know that Lucy asked me if I was staying forever, and I told her yes. I also know that Isabel let me in when she was sick and scared, and she didn't let anyone else in, not even her grandmother, until after the fever broke." She held his gaze. "You don't walk away from that because it isn't technically your legal responsibility. That's not who I am." He stared at her for a long moment. The kind of looking that isn't searching for something specific, but just taking something in. "No," he said finally. "I don't think it is." Grace went to find Harriet herself. She did not tell Graham she was going to do it. She found the woman in the front parlor with her needlework, which Grace had come to understand was what Harriet did when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't ready to talk about yet. Grace sat down across from her without being invited. Harriet looked up. "I know about the petition," Grace said. Harriet set down her needlework. She did not flinch, but something in her went very still. "It was filed before you arrived," Grace said. "Before Isabel got sick. Before anything that happened this week." "Yes," Harriet said. "Was it already decided? Was everything you said to me in the garden, in the kitchen, was that you gathering evidence, performing?" Harriet was quiet for a moment, and then she said something Grace had not expected. "No, it began that way. It did not end that way." Grace looked at her. "I came here with a conclusion," Harriet said. Her voice was flat and honest and cost her something. "I came here expecting to find exactly what I feared: a household in disorder, a man in over his head, and a woman who married into this family for financial convenience and nothing else." She paused. "I found the financial convenience part accurate enough. I found nothing else I expected." "And the petition," Grace said. "My attorney is good at his job," Harriet said. "He filed when I told him to file. I cannot undo that with a letter in time for it to matter." "Then attend the hearing," Grace said. "Tell the judge what you saw here." Harriet looked at her sharply. "You're asking me to testify against my own petition," she said. "I'm asking you to tell the truth," Grace said, "which is that those girls are safe, that they are loved, that this household is not perfect, but it is real, and it is theirs, and taking them from it would cause more damage than whatever you were afraid of when you filed." She leaned forward slightly. "You love them, Mrs. Ashford. I have watched you with them for a week, and I know you love them. So I am asking you woman to woman, to love them the right way." The silence that followed was so thick, Grace could feel it pressing against her chest. Harriet's hands were still on the fabric of her needlework, perfectly controlled. "You are a great deal more formidable than you look," she said finally. I've been told that before too, Grace said. Harriet left the next morning. She said goodbye to the girls at the door, Lucy clinging Isabel, allowing a brief embrace with her arms held slightly stiff, which was Isabel's version of genuine affection. She shook Graham's hand. She looked at Grace for a long moment before she climbed into the carriage. "I make no promises," she said. "I'm not asking for promises," Grace said. "Just honesty." Harriet nodded once. Then she was gone. Graham stood beside Grace on the front step, and they both watched the carriage disappear down the drive. "Do you think she'll do it?" he said. "I think she's deciding," Grace said. "I think that's the best we can ask for." He turned to look at her then. The morning light was strong and direct, and Grace felt suddenly very aware of it, of him looking at her with nothing managing his expression for once, no careful distance, no professional composure. "Grace," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. He stopped. "Not yet," she said. "There's still a court hearing in 3 weeks and I need to stay clear-headed. Whatever." She paused, chose words carefully. "Whatever is shifting between us, I need it to wait until the girls are safe. Can you give me that?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, yes. She nodded, went back inside. Behind her, she heard him stay on the step a moment longer before following. The 3 weeks moved fast and slow, in the way that only time before a reckoning can. Grace threw herself into preparation. She wrote out a documented account of her management of the household since her arrival. The accounts, the staffing decisions, the medical incident with Isabel in the clearest, most precise language she could manage. She had Graham's attorney, a man named Jasper Cole, review it 3 times. Cole was a small, sharp-eyed man from Richmond who chewed on a pencil when he was thinking, and had the kind of quiet confidence that Grace recognized as the real kind, rather than the performed kind. "The medical documentation is strong," he told them at the kitchen table on the 2nd week. "The foxglove treatment will be questioned. You need to be ready for that." "It worked," Graham said. "That's not how law operates, I'm afraid," Cole said. "They'll argue it was reckless regardless of the outcome. We need witnesses who can speak to her character and judgment." He looked at Grace. "Who can vouch for you?" Grace thought about this for a moment. "Della," she said. "The cook. She's watched me manage this house from the first day. She's respected in town, and she doesn't soften her opinions for anyone." She paused. "And Isabel." Cole looked up from his pencil. "The child herself." "She's 13, Grace said, "and she is sharper than anyone in that courtroom will be prepared for. If the judge will allow it, Isabel's own account of what happened during her illness carries more weight than anything I can argue." Cole tapped his pencil against the table. "It's unusual." "Is it possible?" Grace pressed. "In this jurisdiction with a judge who has children of his own?" Cole considered. "Possibly." "Then we try," Grace said. Graham looked at her across the table. Cole was writing something and didn't see the look. It was brief, just a second, but there was something in it that Grace filed away, in the part of herself she was currently keeping under strict management. Later she found Isabel in the hallway. "I need to ask you something," Grace said. Isabel waited. At the hearing, Grace said, "There may be an opportunity for you to speak to the judge directly. To say what you saw during your illness. What you've seen in this house." She kept her voice even, factual. No manipulation, no pressure. "You are not required to. This is not something I am asking you to do for me or your father. I'm asking if you would want to." Isabel looked at her with those dark, steady eyes that always seemed to be calculating something several layers deeper than the surface conversation. "Would it help?" Isabel said. "It might make the difference," Grace said honestly. "Then yes," Isabel said. Simple, immediate, like there had never been any other answer. Grace nodded. "Thank you." "Grace." Isabel stopped her as she turned. "When this is over, when it's settled, are you still going to be here?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. "Yes," Grace said. You said that before, Isabel said. But you said it like a fact then. Now it sounds like you're not sure. Grace turned back fully and looked at the girl. At 13 years old, seeing things her father was still working up to seeing. I am sure, Grace said. About staying. About all of it. She paused. The rest I'm still working out. Isabel nodded slowly. That's honest. I'm always honest with you, Grace said. I know, Isabel said. It's one of the things I've decided I trust about you. She turned and went up the stairs, leaving Grace standing in the hallway, holding that sentence like something fragile and necessary. The night before the hearing, Grace could not sleep again. She reflected a woman with a serious relationship with insomnia and hallway floors. She sat at the kitchen table this time instead with a candle and a cup of cold tea, and she made herself look at everything clearly. Tomorrow, a judge would decide whether Graham Wellington was fit to raise his own daughters, whether this household imperfect new cobbled together from grief and transaction and something that had grown slowly into something else was enough. Whether she was enough. She heard footsteps on the stairs and knew them by now without having to look. Graham sat down across from her. Same as before, no ceremony, no announcement, just showing up. You should sleep, she said. You should too, he said. They sat in silence for a moment. I'm frightened, Graham said. He said it like a confession, like a man saying something out loud that he has been trying very hard not to say. I keep telling myself to be steady. You told me to be steady, and you're right. But the truth is, I am terrified that I will walk into that courtroom tomorrow, and it will not be enough, and they will take... He stopped. They are all I have. Grace looked at him across the candlelight. They are not all you have, she said quietly. He met her eyes. Whatever this is, she said carefully, slowly, because she had promised herself she would wait, and she was perhaps not quite waiting. Whatever this has become in the last 7 weeks, you are not walking into that courtroom alone. I need you to know that. He was quiet for a long moment. The candlelight moved slightly. When I married you, he said, I thought I was making a practical arrangement. I thought I knew exactly what it was and wasn't. He paused. I was wrong about what it wasn't. Grace pressed her lips together, held still. After tomorrow, she said, we can talk about the rest of it. After tomorrow, he agreed. He reached across the table, and his hand covered hers just briefly, just once. Then he stood. Get some sleep, he said. Likewise, she said. He went upstairs. Grace sat a moment longer, her hand still on the table where his had been. Tomorrow. First the courthouse. First the fight. First the thing she had to win before she could let herself want anything else. She blew out the candle and went upstairs. The morning was already beginning at the edges of the dark. The courthouse in Charlottesville was a brick building on a corner lot that smelled like old paper and wood polish, and the particular staleness of rooms where important things had been decided for a long time. Grace knew none of that from the outside. She only knew it when she walked in, and the smell hit her, and something in her chest tightened, and she made herself breathe through it the way she had made herself breathe through everything else over the last 7 weeks. Graham was beside her, not touching, but beside her in the way that had come to mean something, that deliberate, steady proximity that said, I am here. I am not going anywhere. Jasper Cole was already at the plaintiff's table, arranging papers with the calm efficiency of a man who had done this many times and understood that visible anxiety was a liability. He nodded when they came in. That was all. Grace looked across the room. Harriet Ashford was seated on the left side of the gallery, not at the opposing counsel's table, in the gallery. Her attorney, a tall man with side whiskers and an expression that suggested he had not been informed of any change in strategy, was sitting alone at the table with a folder of documents and a look of mild confusion. Grace saw this and said nothing. She sat down beside Graham and folded her hands in her lap and kept her face still. Graham had seen it too. She felt him go very slightly still beside her. She's not sitting with her attorney, he said quietly. No, Grace said. What does that mean? "I don't know yet," Grace said. "Stay steady." Judge Harlan Whitfield was a heavy-set man in his 60s with a white beard and reading glasses he kept removing and replacing as he reviewed documents. He called the proceeding to order without ceremony and summarized the petition in the flat, efficient language of someone who had read a great many petitions and found most of them to be less complicated than the people involved believed them to be. Harriet's attorney, a man named Croft, presented the petition's case first. He spoke about stability, about the speed of Graham's remarriage, about the unknown background of the new wife, about the unorthodox medical treatment administered to a minor without full physician oversight. He used the word reckless twice. He used the phrase, the children's best interests, so many times it began to lose its shape. Grace sat through it with her hands folded and her face composed and told herself it was just words. Words were not the verdict. The verdict was still to come. When Croft sat down, Jasper Cole stood. He was methodical. He presented the household accounts balanced, improved, organized in Grace's handwriting. He presented statements from Della, from Tad, from two neighboring families who had interacted with Grace in the weeks since her arrival. He presented Dr. Pearson's documented record of Isabel's illness, the treatment, and the outcome. He was careful with the foxglove, framed it not as recklessness, but as informed action under crisis, supported by documented precedent, authorized by the child's legal guardian. He was good. Grace had known he was good. But she watched the judge's face, and she could not read it, and that frightened her in a way that Croft's opening had not. Then Cole said, "Your Honor, I'd like to call Isabel Wellington to speak." Croft was on his feet immediately. "Objection. The child is 13 years old," Cole said calmly, "and present in this courtroom at her own request. She is the primary subject of this petition, Your Honor. Her testimony is directly relevant." Judge Whitfield looked over his reading glasses at the gallery. At Isabel, who was sitting beside Lucy in the second row with her spine straight and her hands in her lap and her face wearing the expression of a girl who has decided something and is not going to be talked out of it. "I'll hear her," Whitfield said. Croft sat down heavily. Isabel walked to the front of the courtroom, the way she did everything with a deliberateness that made her seem older than her years, and a composure that Grace knew from the inside of Isabel's fever, and the inside of Isabel's fear was not the absence of feeling, but the decision to feel it later. Cole asked her simple questions. She answered them simply. What was her daily life like? Who managed the household? What was her relationship with her stepmother? Isabel answered without embellishment and without drama, and somehow the absence of both made everything she said feel more true than any rehearsed testimony could have. Then Cole asked, "Can you describe the night you became ill?" And Isabel told it. All of it. She described waking up and knowing something was wrong and not wanting to say anything because her grandmother was visiting and she didn't want to cause trouble. She described Grace coming into her room and feeling her forehead and looking at the rash and not panicking, not performing calm, but actually having it. She described Grace telling her she was going to be all right with a voice that meant it. "Were you frightened?" Cole asked. "Yes," Isabel said. "And did Mrs. Wellington help with that fear?" Isabel paused for a moment. The courtroom was completely silent. "She sat with me through the whole night," Isabel said. "Both nights. She sat in the hallway when she wasn't in the room because she didn't want me to feel alone." She looked straight ahead. "My mother died, and my father was devastated, and I had to be the strong one because somebody had to be. Grace was the first adult in this house since my mother died, who made me feel like I didn't have to be." She paused. "I'm 13. I shouldn't have to be the strong one all the time." She understood that without me telling her. The silence after that lasted several seconds. Judge Whitfield removed his reading glasses, cleaned them, put them back. "Thank you, Miss Wellington," he said. His voice was slightly different than it had been before. Grace noticed. She thought most of the room noticed. Isabel walked back to her seat. She sat down. She looked at Grace once direct and steady, and Grace nodded once back. Then the twist came. Croft stood for his cross-examination, and Grace braced herself. He was not a stupid man. He had listened to Isabel's testimony, and he knew the damage it had done to his case, and he was going to try to recover it. "Miss Wellington," he said pleasantly, "you have described Mrs. Wellington very favorably, but would you say that your opinion of her might be influenced by the fact that she saved your life? That gratitude might be coloring your account?" Isabel looked at him. "I didn't like her much at first," Isabel said. "I was polite because my father expected it, but I watched her for the first 3 weeks waiting for her to show her real face the way people do when they stop trying." She paused. She never stopped trying, and her real face turned out to be the same as the face she showed on day 1. Another pause. "That's not gratitude. That's just what I observed." Croft opened his mouth, closed it, tried another angle. "Your father's decision to remarry so quickly." "My father was drowning," Isabel said flatly. "He was trying to run a farm and raise 2 children and not fall apart completely after my mother died, and he was doing all 3 of those things badly because he's only one person." Her voice did not waver. "Grace didn't replace my mother. Nobody could do that. But she stopped my father from drowning. I think that's allowed." Croft looked at his notes. He looked at the judge. He said, "No further questions," and sat down like a man acknowledging a field he has lost. Then Harriet Ashford stood up. From the gallery. Not called, not announced. She simply stood, and the room turned toward her the way rooms turn toward something unexpected and undeniable. Judge Whitfield raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Ashford, you are aware you are not a called witness." "I am aware," Harriet said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. "I am also the petitioner of record, and I have information relevant to this proceeding that has not been entered. I am asking the court's indulgence." Whitfield looked at her for a long moment. At Croft, whose expression had gone somewhere past confusion into something approaching alarm. At Cole, who was very carefully not smiling. "I'll allow it," Whitfield said, briefly. Harriet walked to the front of the room without haste. She stood before the judge, and she folded her hands, and she spoke. "I filed this petition," she said, "because I was afraid. My daughter died in that house, and I believed the fastest way to protect my granddaughters was to remove them from it. I came to Wellington Manor intending to find justification for a decision I had already made." She paused. "I did not find what I came for. I found a household that is imperfect and new, and still finding its shape. I found a man who loves his daughters and is learning slowly to stop punishing himself for surviving his wife. And I found a woman who administered an experimental treatment to my granddaughter in the middle of the night because she could not stand to do nothing, and because of that treatment, my granddaughter is sitting in this courtroom today." The room was completely still. "I am not withdrawing this petition because Grace Wellington asked me to," Harriet said. "I am withdrawing it because it is wrong. Because those girls are where they belong, and removing them would cause harm that this court would not be responsible for, but that I would carry for the rest of my life." She looked at Whitfield directly. "I would ask the court to dismiss." Croft was on his feet. "Your Honor, my client cannot unilaterally." "She is the petitioner of record, Mr. Croft," Whitfield said calmly. "She can, and she has." He looked at the papers in front of him for exactly 4 seconds. "Petition dismissed. Mr. Wellington retains full custody. We're adjourned." The gavel came down. Grace did not cry in the courtroom. She had decided she was not going to do that, and she held to it through the gavel, and through Cole gripping Graham's hand, and through Lucy launching herself out of the gallery and hitting Grace around the middle like a small determined projectile. She held on to Lucy, and she pressed her face into the child's hair, and she breathed. "Is it over?" Lucy said into Grace's shoulder. "It's over," Grace said. "Are we keeping you?" Grace pulled back and looked at her, this small, round-faced, fearlessly direct little girl who had asked on her second day whether Grace was staying forever and had been waiting for a real answer ever since. "You are absolutely keeping me," Grace said. Lucy pulled her back in and held on with both arms, and Grace let her. Over Lucy's head she looked at Graham. He was standing a few feet away watching her with an expression that had nothing managed about it at all, completely open, completely unguarded the face of a man who has just had something he was terrified of losing, confirmed to still be his. Grace held his gaze. She did not look away. Outside the courthouse, Harriet found her. Graham had taken the girls to speak with Cole. Grace was standing alone for a moment, just standing, feeling the summer heat and the strange stillness that follows a fight that is finally finished. "You didn't have to do that," Grace said when Harriet reached her. "I know," Harriet said. "You could have let your attorney handle the dismissal quietly, done it through paperwork." "Yes," Harriet said. "I could have." She was quiet for a moment. Margaret always said that the right thing done quietly is still the right thing, but the right thing done in the open is a statement. A pause. "She was, as I mentioned, a remarkable woman." Grace looked at her. "You are not her," Harriet said. It was not an insult. It was simply true, and Harriet was above all things a woman who dealt in true things. "You will never be her, and I am not asking you to be. But you are." She paused, choosing words with the precision of someone who does not use them loosely. "You are someone those children can build on. That is not a small thing." Grace's throat tightened. "Thank you," she said. Harriet nodded once, brisk and final the way she ended most things that mattered. Then she said, "I would like to visit, regularly, if that is acceptable." "It is more than acceptable," Grace said. "Good." Harriet looked across to where the girls were standing with Graham. Lucy was telling him something with enormous animation, her hands moving, her whole body involved in the story. Isabel was watching with that small, reluctant, almost smile that was her version of joy. "They are extraordinary children," Harriet said quietly. She would be so proud of them." "She is," Grace said. She wasn't entirely sure what she meant by it. She meant it anyway. Harriet made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, and walked to say goodbye to her granddaughters. The drive home was loud. Lucy talked for 40 minutes without noticeable pause covering the judge's beard. The smell of the courtroom, whether Isabel's testimony would be written about in newspapers, and whether they might stop for pie on the way home. Isabel contributed occasional dry commentary that made Cole sharing the carriage with them laugh twice in genuine surprise. Graham sat across from Grace, and they looked at each other over the heads of the girls and did not need to say anything. Some things accumulate past the point of needing words. They stopped for pie. That evening, the house was different. Not in the physical sense. The same rooms, the same furniture, the same Carolina summer heat pressing at the windows. But the quality of the air inside it was different. Lighter. Like something that had been held under pressure for a long time had finally been allowed to expand into its natural shape. Della made a meal that was demonstrably celebratory, without anyone having specifically requested it. Mrs. Holt, who had never once in Grace's tenure offered her an unsolicited word of warmth, set the table and then stood in the dining room doorway and said, "Well done, Mrs. Wellington," in a voice that was still not warm exactly, but was closer to it than Grace had thought she would ever get. "Thank you, Mrs. Holt," Grace said. Mrs. Holt nodded and went back to the kitchen. Lucy fell asleep at the table at 8:30 with her face still slightly sticky from the pie. Graham carried her upstairs without waking her, moving with the practiced ease of a man who had done this thousands of times, who knew the specific weight of his daughter in his arms, and the specific way to turn through a doorway without bumping her head. Grace watched him go, and felt something in her chest that was not the managed, careful, kept-at-distance feeling she had been disciplining herself with for 7 weeks. Something full. Something that fit the actual shape of what this was. Isabel stopped her in the hallway on the way upstairs. "Grace." She said it the way she always said it, direct, no preamble. "I want to say something." "Go ahead," Grace said. "When you first came," Isabel said, "I decided you were temporary. I decided not to attach because temporary things leaving is worse than never having them." She held Grace's gaze. "I was wrong to decide that. I know that now." Grace did not rush to fill the silence. "I'm not temporary," Grace said. "I know," Isabel said. "That's what I'm saying." She shifted slightly, the almost imperceptible movement of someone about to do something they've been working up to. Then she stepped forward and put her arms around Grace briefly, firmly, and let go. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was the most deliberate 4 seconds Grace could remember. "Good night," Isabel said, and went upstairs. Grace stood in the hallway alone and pressed her hand flat over her heart and breathed. Graham found her on the back porch. The night was warm and the fields were dark, and the rose bushes along the fence line were shapes in the shadow, wild and unpruned still after all this time. He sat in the chair beside her. Same as the first time. Same porch. Same summer, a completely different version of both of them. "I've been thinking about Margaret's roses," he said. Grace waited. He stopped. Restarted. "I think it would be all right to tend them, not to change them, not to make them something else." He paused. "Just to take care of what's already there." Grace understood he was not talking only about the roses. She also understood he was not ready yet to say the thing directly, and that was all right. She had learned to hear him in layers. "I think that sounds right," she said. He turned to look at her in the dark. "I've been wrong about a great many things," he said. "I want you to know I'm aware of that." "Such as," she said. "The transaction," he said quietly. "I told you in the study on our first night that this was a transaction and nothing more. I told myself I believed that." A pause. "I was already wrong by the end of the first week. I just didn't have the courage to admit it." Grace looked at him steadily. "What changed?" she said. "You sat in the kitchen garden and asked whether tending Margaret's roses would feel like an intrusion," he said. "And then you said you'd leave them until I knew." He shook his head slightly. "Nobody had in 14 months, nobody had asked me what I needed. They all told me what I should do to grieve properly and move forward correctly. You asked." He paused. "That was the end of the transaction. I just kept calling it one because it was easier." Grace was quiet for a moment. "Graham," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you said after. I know the timing is—" "I wasn't going to tell you to wait," she said. He went still. "I spent 7 weeks telling myself to be careful," she said. "To stay clear-headed. To keep the line between what this is and what it was supposed to be." She turned to face him fully. "But Isabel just hugged me for the first time in that hallway, and Lucy called this house home this afternoon, not your house or Papa's house, just home. And you sat on this floor with me at 3 in the morning when you didn't have to." She paused. "I don't want to keep managing this down to something smaller than it is. I'm tired of doing that." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I am not good at this yet, at allowing things, at letting people in without catastrophizing the losing of them." "I know," Grace said. "I will probably be difficult." "Graham," she said. "I have managed your household accounts, administered experimental medicine to your daughter in the middle of the night, and stood in front of a judge on your behalf. I think I can manage difficult." Something broke open in his face, not dramatically, not with enormous theatrics, but cleanly and completely the way ice breaks in early spring all at once, after a long time of being ready. He reached across and took her hand, the way he had at the kitchen table the night before. But this time, he didn't let go. "I think," he said slowly, "that I would like to learn to deserve you." Grace looked at his hand over hers, looked up at him. "That's not how it works," she said. "You don't have to earn what's already yours." He looked at her like a man being handed something he has been afraid to hope for and is only just beginning to believe is real. "Stay," he said quietly. "Not a transaction, not a negotiation, just the word honest and direct, stripped of everything except what it meant." "I already told Lucy forever," Grace said. She felt him exhale a long, slow release, like a man setting down something he has carried too far. His thumb moved once across the back of her hand. They sat in the dark together, not speaking, listening to the summer pressing all around them. The roses were still wild along the fence. They would tend them tomorrow. There was time now. Grace Montgomery had come to this house broken and broke with $40 and a single trunk, and a transaction that was supposed to keep her safe. She had found instead of safety something harder and more real, a family in pieces, learning to hold itself together, a man learning that survival was not the same as living two girls who needed someone to stay. She had stayed, not because she had to, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because some things, once you understand what they are, you cannot walk away from. Some things choose you as much as you choose them. This house was hers now. These children were hers. This man with his walls and his grief and his slow, hard-won honesty was hers. And she was theirs completely without reservation, without the careful distance she had carried in like armor on the first night, and had long since set down somewhere she could no longer find. The summer night held them all. The roses grew wild along the fence and could wait one more day. Grace Wellington was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she had known it, she realized, since the moment she stopped pretending she didn't.